Okay. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry we can't all be in the same room again, but life has changed course again. Just before Christmas, we decided it was probably better if we did this one by Zoom. So I'm very sorry about that, but hopefully eventually we will be able to meet again in person. But tonight we have an extremely interesting paper, which I'm sure you're all going to enjoy. David Roberts undertook his PhD on the landscapes of Wessex and Provence in the Roman period, supervised by Kevin Walsh and Steve Roscombs at the University of York. From 2013 to 2021, he worked as an archaeologist managing research projects for English heritage, then historic England, most recently leading new excavations at Lowham Roman Villa. His research focuses on people's interaction with landscape, and whilst mainly focused on the Roman period, has also encompassed a significant programme of excavation and publication in the Stonehenge landscape. He has recently been appointed lecturer in Roman archaeology at Cardiff University, so congratulations to him for that. Tonight, however, he will be talking about a Roman shrine complex at Teffont, Wiltshire. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. So today I'm going to talk to you about a site that's really, I guess, shaped my whole career. It began with me as a student and has kind of my development and the development of it, our understanding of it have followed each other over the years. It began in 2008 when I was still an undergraduate and did some field walking there, and slightly got out of hand after that and became really quite a long-running field school and research project. Essentially, it's an investigation of a very complex Roman landscape. Its basic aims are listed out on the slide here, and it's a combination of training project, community engagement, and of course, research and publication. Now, Teffont is in something of a archaeologically, or at least in recent terms, neglected corner of Wiltshire. It nestles just to the south of what's known locally as the Great Ridge, which runs from Wilton up towards Warminster and finishes at the Great Temple of Cold Kitchen Hill. The nearby, as it were, academic honeypots of Stonehenge and Cranbourne Chase have to some extent led to this region being rather overlooked. And also in terms of Roman Britain, it's hardly the centre of things. There's no really major town anywhere nearby. There's a small town at Sorvia Dunum, next to Old Sarum, Stratford Sub-Castle, and there's the main Roman road, of course, that runs along the Great Ridge. But because of the lack of commercial development, meaning relatively little development mitigation archaeology, there's been relatively little modern work in the area. As such, there's an extraordinary amount of Roman archaeology that's coming to light through metal detecting and through other community-led research. Teffont's landscape is quite typical for villages in this area. It starts out the parish on the Chalk Downs to the north, up on the Great Ridge, and then there's these large enclosed fields, which until the development of modern agriculture were grazed with sheep, effectively since the post-Roman period. And they run down to the south, and then as we move off the chalk into the greensand and then limestones, the fields and settlement pattern becomes more complicated, denser, more woodland, and so on. And at the bottom of the valley is the River Nadder, one of several tributaries to the Salisbury Avon. It's quite a typical pattern of settlement and allows diversity of ecological opportunity for farmers in the area. Now, if we go to our gazetteers and so on and look at what the archaeology of Teffont is, it has a pretty standard selection for southern Wiltshire. It has a unival at Hillfort. It has an apparent Iron Age burial at the major spring in Teffont Magna. And of course, this being Wiltshire, there are the usual selection of mounds of various types, mostly Bronze Age barrows, but one, if we were to look at a gazetteer, would stick out as it's rather oddly scheduled as being Roman archaeology. There's also a scatter of PAS finds on Teffont Down, and these include, yes, your usual smattering of Numi and other rather grotty late Roman coins, but also a few more early Roman coins than is normal, and certainly a few more late Iron Age coins than is normal. So there's just the sort of hints here in the background data. There's a bit more going on than perhaps is normal. Then as we move past the Roman period, we see that Teffont Magna Church has a quite fine cross slab. There are a series of very good late medieval houses and some quite significant listed buildings in both the Teffont Vias and Teffont Magna. The bottom right is Wickball Camp hill fort up dominating the Teffont Valley. If we look at Roman Teffont, we can see from things like the Victoria County history and the HER that there are multiple sites of interest, and this again is a little bit more than normal. There's a major cemetery in the south of Teffont Magna. Now, estimates vary as to the number of individuals excavated from here between the wars. The official estimate, I think, is about 30. Local word of mouth has it well over 100. The cemetery was not excavated by archaeologists or antiquarians. It was effectively found during lime quarrying in the now site of special scientific interest in Black Furlong Wood. And the quarry workers destroyed the significant majority of the kists and apparently sarcophagi that were excavated in this cemetery. A number of finds were retrieved by various local amateurs, and some have ended up in Salisbury Museum. So if we believe the upper end of that estimate, it's one of the largest Roman cemeteries in the county. Even at the lower end, it's one of the larger ones. And then there's this scheduled mound in Upper Holt Wood. The basis for this being thought a temple or shrine was certainly very unclear at the time of scheduling, which we'll come on to shortly. And there are, of course, local finds of pottery and these various Port Antiquity Scheme finds. When it comes to previous work in Teffont, we're really looking at a picture, like I said, of no commercial archaeology in the parish and no modern academic research projects in the parish or the surrounding parishes. However, there has been a considerable amount of amateur work in the 1950s to 1970s by one Ron Lever. Ron was the village or jobsman, agricultural worker and undertaker at various points. He had a keen interest in history and archaeology and was completely self-taught. He had very little contact with the formal archaeological world because, of course, records such as that on the right-hand side here from one of Ron's notebooks don't seem quite right for the 50s, 60s and 70s, the era when archaeology was professionalizing, and this sort of thing might be thought to belong some decades earlier. Nevertheless, whenever we've looked at Lever's records, he's been proved to be remarkably accurate in terms of what he actually found. Unfortunately, though, we only have access to one surviving notebook of the many that he originally filled in. We believe there were 3 or 4. Unfortunately, many were burnt after his death and almost all of his extensive collection of finds was discarded. 1 biscuit tin worth of finds remained, which we've had catalogued, and we're very grateful to his family for sharing those with us. There's a very creditable village history by 2 local residents that was conducted around the millennium, and it's the traditional sort of oral history of the village, written document history of the changes over the medieval and post-medieval periods, and deals creditably with the archaeology as well. So there's actually relatively little previous work for us to kind of draw on when we were designing this project. So I should perhaps say a word now about what we've actually done. So this project doesn't take life in the normal, I guess, academic, well-planned sort of formal manner of all of my other research projects. This has grown organically over time. As I said, it began as a student project and has changed since. We've conducted a large amount of work, a great deal of landscape survey, obviously desktop study, multi-method woodland survey, because some of the circumstances of excavation, as some in the audience will be able to attest, are quite challenging in terms of the density of woodland cover. And between about 2010 and 2015, we ran largish field schools between 25 and 40 participants per season. However, these were only ever for 2 or 3 weeks in the summer, and so it's been quite a gradual process for all it's been long running. We have an ongoing specialist assessment program, and of course, I'm writing up the stratigraphy as we go, and that puts us in quite a good position to start talking about the site. Nevertheless, because of the large scale of landscape we're looking at and the complexity of some of the archaeology, we're still, I think, at a relatively interim stage in understanding the site, though we're able to make some broad brush interpretations. One of the things I'm proudest of the project, though, is its long-term commitment to training and to developing our team members. All our current supervisors have come through the project as students initially, and we've got a very strong record of transitioning participants into archaeological employment or into jobs elsewhere where they, for some reason, wish to come back and spend their summers with us every year. And we've delivered well over 2,000 days of training over that period. So let's look at the sites in detail. Our work focuses on Upper Holt Wood, which is set up here on a ridge right at the edge of the greensand coming off the chalk up here to the north. We'll also talk about Holt Field to the northeast and the Glebe to the southwest. This is set to the west of Teffont and the southwest of Teffont Magna, the parish boundary running along the ridge of the Upper Holt. You can see that there's quite a lot of different types of geology going on here. And that's, I think, part of why this is a significant place to people in the past. You've got a lot of opportunities to do different things in this landscape, and it's also a natural kind of marginal place, I suppose, or place of transition. This is the Upper Holt looking from the south to the north. Within that bank of woodland, it's really quite a steep ridge running gently from east to west and very steeply from north to south. This is a multi-directional hillshade plot from LiDAR of the Upper Holt, and you can see, I hope, a number of features on here. The arable fields have, of course, seen features ploughed relatively flat, but there's a number of banks, ditches, trackways, and so on. The key part that we'll be looking at, though, is this enclosure within Upper Holt and the mound next to it. So if I zoom in here, you can see that there is this mound. This is scheduled as being Roman archaeology, and next to it there is this enclosure. It's polygonal, I mean broadly rectilinear. It's got an opening at this corner, and a modern gate cutting through it just here. It narrows slightly towards its western end. You can also see this deep feature here. This is the modern parish ditch boundary and the series of terraces south of the ridge down the steep slope. Here is that mound with a 5'3"-ish archaeologist to scale. He still claims he's 5'5". And the observant of you will notice that there is a whacking great hole through the middle. This is not the result of the work of Ron Lever, Teffont's enthusiastic amateur archaeologist of the 50s and 60s, but the result of some 1920s unrecorded antiquarian work by one Colonel Kennedy Shaw, a local resident. This is Ron Lever's schematic diagram of the mound when he undertook excavations just to the southwest of it. Lever's excavations in the mound are important because they're the thing that alerts really the archaeological authorities to the existence of a Roman site here. We'll never know why Lever chose to dig just to the west of the mound rather than down the middle, but I'm very glad he did. Within his small cutting, he found a stone wall, a chalk floor, and another wall at right angles to that, butting up against the parish boundary. What he doesn't show on here, though, is the hoard of, depending on which part of his notebook you believe, between 225 and 405 Roman coins. That marked it out as a major find, and when Lever reported this to Salisbury Museum, various correspondence was exchanged, and effectively the site and an arbitrary area either side of it was scheduled to prevent Lever digging any more holes and finding anything more significant. And I can quite understand the urge behind that at the time, given Ron's fairly amateur methods. But without his work, we wouldn't know it was there. So I think he's perhaps got a slightly bad rep in previous people who've looked at the site. Now, these days, we have a suite of methods available to us when we go trying to understand what archaeology there is in woodland. Many of these were developed in North America first rather than Britain. And I should say as well that when we started this, we had no access to high quality LiDAR for the site, and that's only very recently become available. So we had to do it the hard way. Along with Steve Roskams, who in his attempts to make me write up my PhD came and helped us with a couple of field seasons, 2013, 2014. We designed a program of shovel pitting, test pitting, and augering to try and model deposits within the woodland. We obviously at this point stayed away from the scheduled area, not having scheduled monument consent. We then mapped that and did some complicated modelling to effectively weight each of these according to their reliability. So test pits were given more emphasis than auger holes as to whether they had any archaeological indicators. We then summed these and undertook some kernel density mapping with that to produce what we felt was a reasonably accurate heat map of where the archaeology was within the woodland. We attempted geophysics, but the coverage was simply too partial and bitty within the dense tree cover of the wood. So this was effectively all of the ways we could think of to attempt to understand the deposits of the wood around the scheduled area. And then since then, there have been a sequence of excavations by us trying to characterize the archaeology of the wood. I'm going to take you through those now. This has certainly been fiddly, it's been difficult, and if I was starting afresh, possibly not the way I'd excavate this now, but the nature of running a small project on a shoestring and with fairly limited resources and incomplete reconnaissance knowledge because of the nature of the terrain means that this is how it's ended up being done. So I'm going to take you through various aspects of the enclosure within the wood, that polygonal thing, and the archaeology set within that. So first, the mound, the scheduled site. We were lucky enough to get scheduled monument consent in 2019, re-excavated the antiquarian trench at its centre, and sure enough, it doesn't look terribly promising in terms of archaeology, almost no finds, and it may very well be that word of mouth suggesting that Kennedy Shaw told the locals he found nothing was correct. However, we quite reasonably recognize that this isn't the bottom of the sequence, so we continued, and sure enough, it gets reasonably complicated lower down. So here we can see a square cut feature set into the slightly offset of the center of the mound. Here's its base. This is a post hole of Roman date with a substantial square post in it. This is not the bottom of the sequence of the mound, and this itself cuts into earlier, probably Bronze Age deposits. Just in the corner of this post hole, you can see that the bottom of the cut intersects with an earlier feature, and you can just see some bits of bone poking out of it. When we cleared away the overlying layer, we found within a shallow cut feature an ABG of a calf, a young calf. Within the central part of the Bronze Age horizon here, there's another cut feature which we did not excavate, but is almost certainly the primary interment. Here's a zoomed in photo of the calf. The outside exterior sequence of the mound is even more interesting to us. In the Roman period, having re-excavated Lever's Trench here and expanded it somewhat, we found that there's a building cut into the edge of it. It's got limestone walls made of local stone, it's got a chalk floor, and those grammars of construction you'll find recur as we go through this sequence. Interestingly, chalk seems to be piled up on top of the mound during this period, and then following the end of the Roman period, the demolition rubble of this structure is deposited on top of the mound. After that, a natural woodland sequence builds up, and then various amateurs and archaeologists interfere with it afterwards. So this is quite a complicated sequence for your standard Bronze Age barrow, quite the afterlife it's got. It's evidently recognised as an important place in the landscape and elaborated in the Roman period. But this is only the tip of the iceberg of the story of the complex. Let's take you now to the northern bank of the complex. Here is a student endearingly pointing at the very top of dense collapse. On the surface, this looks like a large woodland bank, but on excavation, it turns out to actually have begun life as a rather smaller woodland bank, but actually then have been developed into a substantial limestone revetting wall. Much of it has been robbed out, but in the three places we've tested it, it's proved to be a rubble core with white limestone facing blocks. This is interesting because it's the only part of this enclosure that's elaborated in this way. So this north-facing wall is selected for particular investment. And it's also a revetting wall. This is barely, we think, even knee height from within the enclosure. It revets the gentle northward slope and provides this kind of white wall looking to the north. I'll go into the reasons we think that's happening later. I should say as well that within the articulated collapse of the wall, we find what appears to be a young lamb sacrificed, complete. I mean, I realize this could simply be butchery, but given the nature of it being set into the wall, I'm reasonably comfortable with calling it sacrifice, complete with the interior vertebra with cut marks. And also, perhaps slightly more surprisingly, human remains within the wall. So we have what appears to be a perinate set into the wall, and we think that's inserted during the construction. So somebody brought this stillbirth or premature birth to this place and deposited it there during that construction process. At the northeastern corner of the enclosure, this trench found very substantial amount of rubble limestone collapse, which, when we pulled it all off, revealed rather a scrubby rectangular foundation with a post hole next to it. The earthwork form of this is mirrored immediately to the east, and we're reasonably confident this is quite a poor quality gateway structure. There's very little sign of decent mortar bonding. There is some there, but we're not talking high quality Roman construction that we see on perhaps the more elaborate and higher status shrine and temple complexes of southern Britain. Nevertheless, there's clearly some investment going into elaborating this complex with stone. When we look at the other side of the complex at the entrance, we also see elaboration in stone. Along the terrace leading there from the southwest, from the site in Glebefield, we see a series of post settings, a cobbled trackway, and just around the entrance, a series of small buildings either side. I haven't got any plans of the building either side of the entrance here because we've only just dug half of it. But one of the most interesting early finds from our assessment of the material from that excavation is that our fallen remains specialist Claire Rainsford has identified a series of right forelimbs of sheep and lambs from a context just behind that building, as if a portion was being removed from animals being brought to the shrine at its entrance. If we go into the enclosure now, we can see a series of small structures. So this one is a repeatedly fired and quite high quality oven, complete with a floor just above it, seemingly. I'm using the word oven slightly caveated here. And then if we move into the middle, we get on to the, I guess, most substantial structures, although still, I must admit, poorly understood. Here we can see an exterior wall in the foreground and an interior wall in the back of the frame. This is part of what we think is probably the main building of this complex. Within the building, there's substantial truncation, as there is with most archaeology in the woodland, due to tree damage and also due to robbing. The bottom left picture here, it's very dark, so forgive the poor quality. It's quite difficult to take good photos given the shading in the woodland. We see a large flat rubber cut within this interior room. The adjacent floor is still there and is made of the same pounded chalk as all the other buildings we find in the complex. Yet despite the apparent large, shallow rubber cut, the wall adjacent to it is still completely in situ, despite being made of high quality masonry. For us, Occam's razor is probably that this means that they've rubbed out a paved floor. There's also this rather enigmatic feature cut into the base of the rubber cut, which seems to involve some kind of small scale melting down, potentially of perhaps some structural nails or similar. In the in the outer room of that building, we also see a pounded chalk floor, again with a black and great tree throw in the middle of it. But underneath that floor, we see a couple of interesting deposits. The first of these is a shallow pit, complete with this interesting worked stone object, which Jerry is still out because it hasn't yet reached our stone specialist to be assessed. But it's clearly not a piece of standard architecture. It's clearly part of an object, whether that be perhaps sideboard or perhaps part of an altar, we're not sure, though quite why that would be used as foundation deposit only in part, we're not sure. Adjacent to that, we have this rather tiny near kist, I'd call it, within which were the remains of a neonate. Another less well articulated neonate was found about 0.5 metre to the left, also under this same chalk floor. So this building has clearly had things of significance put into it. What I want to talk to you about as well with the building is that this rather large feature in the foreground, just inside the building, that the observant amongst you will have noticed, this large pit. Now, you can see that the wall here is slightly subsiding, and you can see this rather odd red clay patch next to it. This is a really neat bit of excavation and observation by Mike Emmer and Brian Kerr and Alison Tanner, I think, to work out what was going on with the sequence. And effectively, they found that there's a very large late Iron Age pit underneath this wall, seemingly totally unrelated to the building. It appears at some stage to have been lined with chalk and had some kind of very rich organic deposit form within it. Sometime later, it appears completely unrelatedly, a wall is built over it and it begins to subside. Then, adjacent to that, a form of small inspection pit is dug and is then, when they've realized the wall is subsiding, absolutely rammed with near pure clay. This doesn't keep the wall up as far as we can tell, but it's an interesting kind of little micro sequence that was quite fun to pick apart. Again, though, that shows you that this isn't the very highest quality building, but investments being made. Adjacent, if you can see on the top right, I should say these aren't, of course, the final publication plans. These are merely schematic indicative things I've knocked together to show you where things are relative to each other for the purposes of the talk. Adjacent to that large building here is a smaller, apparently post-built building with only small dwarf walls around two sides of it. It's again got chalk floors, and as you can see in the bottom right photo, a series of pits and post holes under the floor. In one of those pits, we find yet another lamb ABG. And so this is clearly a kind of consistent grammar of use of the place and ways of building and particular things that are important as deposits under these. Now, that's been quite a sort of, I guess, rapid ramble through various aspects of the core of the site. So I kind of put this up to try and draw it together a bit. There are some signs as well, I should say, of perhaps middening just behind that revetting wall to the north. And of course, I've not talked about the majority of the complex, which seems to be, archaeologically speaking, empty. Now, the little bits of molluscan evidence that we've got and had analysed by Claire Rainsford and Terry O'Connor do suggest that this is predominantly wooded, this enclosure, in the Roman period. So Occam's razor is that, given the place name evidence which suggests this is wooded in the early medieval period, this is also, other than where the buildings are in this eastern part of the enclosure in the east centre, also wooded in the Roman period, which leads us on to some quite interesting thoughts about what this might have looked like, how it might have been used, why it might have been significant. However, that does remain only a hypothesis at present, and we're looking to get some more molluscan evidence to prove that or disprove that for sure in the coming years. I'd like to move on next to talking briefly about what I'd term the satellite sites to this. So first of these is in Glebe Field, just to the southwest of the Upper Holt. This was the very first place I did any work in Teffont, thanks to the late Dr. Bill Keating, who told me that there was a lot of red pottery coming up in this field. I should go and have a look. And as a young student, I dutifully trotted off, and with the help of Jasper Bacon, the farmer, picked up an awful lot of Samian ware from the central part of the field. And even to my second year undergraduate or third year undergraduate archaeological awareness, I thought this might be important. And so we undertook geophysics and then followed that up with excavation over the next several years. The magnetometry suggests that there are multiple enclosures within the field, the chief of which seems to be this D-shaped enclosure slightly to the east of the centre. It's got two trackways, one, perhaps the earlier, running out of the front heading west, and you can then see that running off, curving to the southwest on the LiDAR, passing by springs down to the southwest of the site at the bottom of the slope. It's also got trackways leading up to the northwest, and then onwards up onto the Upper Holt Ridge, and indeed along the crest, along the terrace, towards that main enclosure. When we did the resistivity, it's very clear that there are two main areas of structures. Here is our interpretation, and here is the raw, fairly unprocessed plot. And you can see that there are effectively two major areas of structures, one in the very center of the field and one slightly east and northeast of the center. It's clearly multi-phase, given how messy the results are, and we undertook sizable excavation, particularly this central building. Here is our trench in 2011, and you can see this wall, which itself is set into the top of the ditch of the earlier enclosure, where it opens out into that trackway leading west. And then in the sort of middle ground of the picture, you can see stretching round to a dark deposit at the north, or the top right of the picture, a large building yet to be excavated in any depth there. Well, as we got on with it, the form of the building emerged, and that central building, which is the left hand of those you can see on this schematic plan, proved to be, relatively speaking, a simple structure, but moderately unusual in form. So it's effectively a rectangular structure with a slightly apsidal northern end, but that northern end is substantially terraced into the slope of the field. It seems to be constructed entirely of stone, although on its eastern side there are some steps up into an open courtyard, which seem to be themselves open in some kind of rough portico-like structure. In the base of that northern half of the building, and you can see a little subdivision poking out from its eastern wall there, there is a very substantial cut feature. We haven't excavated it, mainly for health and safety reasons, because it's very deep. But that cut feature is attended by this stepping, curving around it, which we think acts as the support, based on analysis of the work stone assemblage, for a substantial vaulted ceiling. The floor of this building is paved in stone, and it seems to have really quite an elaborate structure. It's possible that that cut feature in the base of the northern end of the building is a well. It could simply be a shaft or pit, as we haven't excavated it yet, but there are some sort of slightly telltale signs in the stone assemblage. For instance, there is a large weight in the collapse of the building, and Kevin's Hayward's interpretation of that particular object are it's either a weight or an anchor, and it seems very unlikely to be an anchor for a substantial vessel stuck up in the southwest Wiltshire countryside. So an unusual building, and outside it from the west runs that later Roman trackway with cobbled surface leading straight up onto the Upper Holt Ridge. To the east is a building we've excavated on a much, much smaller scale. We've effectively dug one room, found a very large stone roof tile collapse into it, a chalk floor, and a small hearth. Again, cobbled surfaces to the exterior of that building. Now, if I was just looking at the plan of these alone, I might think, well, perhaps it's a very small stone domestic structure with some kind of very small scale accompanying, unheated bathhouse, perhaps. But the trackway and the links to the Upper Holt complex, I think, perhaps make this something more unusual, perhaps a support structure where people might stay and perform ablutions on the way to visiting that hilltop complex. We'll now move to the northeast of the hilltop complex. So right outside the gates, we have a series of enclosures, various kind of magnetic anomalies, and further out into that field, we once again see a major trackway leading up from the northeast upslope towards the corner where the gate is. Debate still rages amongst our team as to whether there is a banjo enclosure in amongst this lot on the magnetometry. Sometimes I can be convinced and sometimes less so. Either way, there's a long-term trackway leading up to the hilltop complex. Frustratingly, the resistivity, which is shown as grayscale here with the green being the magnetometry interpretation, is almost completely unreliable on greensand. We've dug a series of trenches here following quite good rectilinear resistance features, and they've proved to be either natural or not there. And where we've dug trenches following magnetometry features, we've found substantial stone buildings which don't show up on the resistivity. This is the perils of greensand, no reflection on our geophysics team. So if we zoom in a little bit, this central trench here partly dug in 2014 and then expanded in 2021. It's two different Roman buildings on very similar alignments, outside of which is a substantial kist, which seems to have been fired in situ. There's no human remains in it, but there's a whole black burnished ware pot smashed on top, and a leg of lamb, and I think a couple of other bits of articulated animal bone that suggests that there's been effectively a funerary feast without the deceased individual's remains being present. So it's perhaps some kind of cenotaph. In 2021, the second of these large buildings we excavated, and you can see this rather strange wall. It's got a rubble core facing on one side, but not the other, and that's because this has been robbed out. You can see nicely formally built. There's this kind of rubble foundation, then these lower courses remain. They're mostly local limestone with hamstone from Somerset. However, next to it is this very scrubby herringbone wall, which, as our observant site supervisor pointed out, is made up of exactly the same proportions of hamstone and local limestone as this, and in fact is almost certainly where the facing from the back half of this wall has ended up. So this is a later reuse of this building to perhaps provide the base plate for a timber structure that's much rougher and more agricultural than what the original Roman stone building was. As for what those are, we honestly cannot really provide a good interpretation based on our limited excavation at present. Ongoing assessment of the artifactual assemblage, I'm sure, will reveal more. So to kind of put that picture together a little for you, I realise it's lots of bits of excavation here and there around quite a wide-ranging complex. We have a site in the southwest where we do certainly have a banjo enclosure, and then that's succeeded by some early Roman buildings, which are then used, interestingly, until only seemingly the turn of the 4th century AD. Remarkably, for a substantially excavated Roman site in Wiltshire, there is only one coin after AD 295 from this southwest site in the glebe, which surely does mean that that site either sees a very substantial reduction in use or ceases to be used at that juncture. Conveniently enough, almost all of the coins from these buildings to the northeast of the hilltop complex date from the 4th century. So I think we see a shift in where these support structures are. And I certainly won't attempt to link that to any historical events. It's evidently a decision based in local, I guess, power structures and the agency, perhaps powerful individuals or communities in this landscape. I should also say a word on the finds. This is not your typical fairly rich Roman shrine temple complex. That may just be because we've not excavated the right part yet, but it may also reflect the nature of what people are doing here and who's using this place. There's a small hoard from seemingly a closure of that building adjacent to the Bronze Age barrow, and there's a scatter of coins in the wider landscape, right from at the very beginning of the Roman period. The hoard tops out at 354 AD, but then other finds from the Upper Holt enclosure go right through until the end of the Roman period. The glebe site in the southwest has a reasonably large assemblage of early brooches, and that confirms that this is present from the very beginning of the Roman period. The closest we've got to any kind of specifically ritual find is this rather odd mount from the hilltop complex, but again, it's found from topsoil by metal detectorists working with us and can't be reliably kind of linked to a particular building or deposit. Where we do see investment at Teffont, though, is in the stone, and I'm absolutely sure that that simply reflects the wealth of this particular community. There is certainly Roman quarrying in Black Furlong, and there is also Roman quarrying at Chilmark and Tisbury just to the west. This stone and the stone from those other local quarries is used throughout the Teffont complex, but particularly in those later elements. The glebe site has a very interesting stone assemblage, which draws on sources from right across southern England and even South Wales. But again, it it's not as high state as that makes it sound like it should be. Kevin's phrase for it was selected seconds. So I do wonder if this is perhaps that this community is enmeshed in networks of exchange relating to stone in southern England, and it's drawing on those for odds and ends to elaborate their local shrine complex. Nevertheless, the actual worked stone assemblage does contain some pretty elaborate architectural elements, such as parts of columns, cornices, water conduits, and this rather nice find from underneath the central building's floor. There are also a significant number of tesserae from both the glebe site, the southwest, and the upper Holt complex itself. However, we have yet to find any in situ mosaics. So I've touched there on why the character of this site is slightly odd and perhaps rather local, and I think it does reflect the communities using it. In Teffont's immediate hinterland, there is a farming settlement at Iwell Farm excavated by Wessex in the 90s. Although, having recently visited the farmer who is himself a metal detectorist there, I think there's rather a lot more to the site. He's into the 800-900s of metal finds off that site since then, and there's some more substantial walling come up. So I think it might be at the very least a very wealthy farm. There are also large nucleated villages on the Great Ridge just to the north. Stockton Earthworks is, depending on which measurement you take, at least over 100 hectares. This is a very large nucleated village. We've got the Roman road running along the ridge, and there are a series, obviously, field systems all over the downs, but a series of other smaller nucleated settlements just to the north of Teffont. So although it seems today quite an idyllic, isolated landscape, it's actually quite densely populated and agriculturally productive in the Roman period. And of course, the Roman cemetery in Black Furlong to the southeast of the Upper Holt complex does suggest that there's an immediately local population living in a site we have not yet found. Looking at the wider sort of traditional map of Roman Wiltshire, Teffont is almost in a blank spot just above where it says Nadder. The Upper Holt is one of those dots on Simon Draper's excellent map. Unlike some of the other sites in the region, it does appear to be religious, but yet lacks ritual material culture. I think that rather than looking on this as a negative or it's an impoverished place, I think simply people are sacrificing and using what wealth they have. So this agricultural community is sacrificing lambs, the sort of fruits of the flock to come, and using the stone that it quarries locally to elaborate this place. And these things and processes would have been important to those people. When you engage in those landscape practices every day, proficiency, skill, and access become really quite prestigious within that community of craftspeople. And I don't think we should underestimate the entanglements of those objects and animals when they're sacrificed and how important they may have been to people, simply because they're not elaborate metal material culture. Going to Roman Wiltshire more widely, there have been some quite significant changes in the last 10 years of how we understand the county. Port of Antiquity scheme has played an absolutely vital role, and this heat map of Port of Antiquity scheme finds on the right that we've created shows the density of finds, and they're concentrated well away from the Roman towns in Wiltshire. They're in the countryside where the agricultural wealth in the late Roman period is being gathered and used by these communities that are exporting grain from Britain to the continent and so on. The rural rich, as we know from looking at the southwest more widely, express their power, prestige, and wealth through, yes, elaborate domestic structures such as villas, but also through investment in some temple complexes, such as in southwest Wiltshire, the recently published South Wiltshire Temple that myself, Steve Roskins, and Richard Henry, amongst others, have worked on. This is more or less the diametric opposite of Teffont. It's very standard in form. It's got your central cellar, central pit being the main focus of deposition within that, with an absolute plethora of metal material culture, including bells, curse tablets, miniaturized objects, votive plaques, mutilated objects, all sorts of items of personal adornment deposited here. And so this demonstrates that different religious sites in this landscape could mean different things and be used by different people. But even here, this site isn't totally about an elite expressing itself with an almost theatrical paganism, because it really is here. The astonishing assemblage of small, miniaturized, I should say, iron votive objects from this site is pretty unparalleled in Britain, and we're really certain that this is closely linked to the presence of an ironworking community on this site. We've excavated smelting on the site, and we've also excavated full-scale ironworking tools of the same forms from the site. So again, we think it's what people are doing in their working lives bleeds into what they're doing in their most ritualized places. And that's kind of the central point of my wider research, is that I don't really think these days that people in Roman archaeology see ritual as something conducted at temples or shrines alone. It's something embedded in everyday life. And I found the work of people like Adrian Chadwick really inspirational on this. And we can see at Teffont, I hope, one quite different articulation of that continuum between everyday and highly ritualized and how they bleed into each other. As for why that happens so strongly in the 3rd and early 4th centuries in the particular region, you could try and link that to historical things, but I think more likely the explanation is that that's kind of a boom time in terms of agricultural production and export in this landscape, and so people are able to express themselves more. Finally, I'd just like to say a word on Teffont's perhaps continuing importance, as articulated especially in the work of Bruce Eagles, in terms of the place name, composed of course of composite tail and fontana or funta, the bounding or boundary spring, which is very suggestive of its later importance in the early medieval period. But Margaret Gelling has also posited that this place name element of funta or fontana is quasi-habitative, that is linked to Roman structures. And it's certainly the case that at those 2 temple sites in southern Wiltshire, on the Fonthill estate and at Teffont, that's true. So I will be interested to see what comes up at other font place names in Wiltshire. Our own work at Urchfont in North Wiltshire does suggest a ritual site there too. And Bruce posits that Teffont is sort of on the edges of a territory in the perhaps 6th century, and certainly 5th century, and that's indicated by its place name as well as distributions of cemeteries and material culture. But I'll let you read his work to get more on that. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge our funders. Richard Keating has been the major donor behind the project and has kept it going with his unflagging enthusiasm and interest. And we've also been lucky enough to get grants from the Royal Archaeological Institute, thank you, the Roman Research Trust and the ARA. We've had help in kind from Salisbury Museum, the University of York and Historic England, but the whole of the project rests on the freely given time and dedication of its many participants. And I'd finally like to thank the other landowners as well, Mr. and Mrs. S. Maybe, for their permission to undertake the work. So thank you very much, and any questions?
Well, thank you very much indeed, David. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm sure there will be lots of questions. If anybody has a question, if you could type it into the chat box, I will try and spot them and read them out. But to give you a bit of time to think of some questions and to get that typing done, I think that was very interesting. It's very important, I agree, to accept that each person's idea of what is worth sacrificing or donating to a deity will be very personal to each worshipper and indeed to each deity. I'm not sure that everybody expected bling, but I'm interested in the lambs. They look to me from the photographs that the lambs were intact, that they had been buried as lambs. So that suggests to me that they weren't part of a ritual meal. It was the killing and placing of the lamb, which was the ritual, not sacrificing the lamb and then eating it and then leaving the bones in a suitable place.
Yeah, that's exactly the thesis. That they are, as far as we're aware, they go in whole or very nearly whole, and it's not about the ritual meal. It's about the sacrifice of future value in the flock. And Claire Rainsford has written about this more extensively, and we've got a paper in review about this together at the moment. But it's about, in that community, the people undertaking that action will understand the genealogies of these animals, they'll understand the potential future value that they might have, and that will have very different entanglements to someone, say, purchasing land for sacrifice at a particular shrine, because that's what you do at that particular festival. I would want to interpret it that way, given the centrality of those foundation deposits, for want of a better phrase, to this temple. It's yes, we do have later the portioning off of right forelimbs at the entrance, and that does seem to be perhaps a more traditional, something to do with the ritual meal. But I think in terms of the establishment of these buildings, lands and therefore agriculture are pretty central.
Does that go on to suggest that we're not dealing with a priesthood here, that it's more personal?
I think it would be very difficult to say either way, but I suspect given the nature of what's happening here, it might be more community-based than highly formalized. But I suspect, again, that may change over time. There's clearly some level of larger scale power operating in this landscape in order for that switch to happen between the glebe site in the southwest and the site to the northeast. That's quite a major restructuring of the landscape. And I didn't get onto it again when I meant to, actually, but that faced wall facing north, it's very tempting to speculate on its level of visibility from the large nucleated settlements and Roman road on the ridge that you can actually see in the background of this Any Questions photo. But that's quite an investment. Someone has put some serious effort into extracting that amount of cut limestone, because 150 meters long by getting on for 2 meters high. So yeah, I don't want to make it sound too much like this is solely the preserve of the local rustics, as it were, and never saw hide nor hair of higher status communities. But I think it's clearly very different to the more elaborate temples in this region.
Thank you. Has anybody got any questions? I'm not getting anything in the chat, but I'm not sure if that's,
everybody into silence.
That's working. Yes, please.
We have a question from Richard New, and he asks, are there any...
Sorry, Matt, could you possibly speak up? You're very quiet.
Am I?
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. We have a question from Richard New, and he asks, are there any signs at all at Teffont of a normal Roman cellar temple structure?
Sorry, of a normal Roman?
Cellar temple structure.
I think the closest we would get to that normal central structure would be that major building near the centre. However, I quite recognise and admit that that has not, as it were, yet got the smoking gun of this is certainly a temple, because we haven't excavated enough to tell that on morphology, and there is no kind of central focus of ritual deposition as of yet that we can see. But we've only excavated a small part of it, and would like to go back and look at it more extensively. But given the size of the walls and the fact that it's got more than one internal room, I think that's as likely a candidate as any.
We have a question from Brian Kerr. Do you think the enclosure wall was meant to be seen from the main Roman road?
I would like that to be the case, but have not yet done the GIS analysis to prove that. It would certainly have been visible for people working in the field systems that spread out between there and the Great Ridge, because effectively the landscape is blanketed in these Romano-Celtic fields from there to the crest of the ridge. Whether the road itself, possibly in some conditions, I'd like to think.
Am I right in thinking it would appear as sort of a white streak across the landscape?
Exactly. Yeah, it would be quite visually striking.
At least when it was new, yes.
Yeah, so it would kind of, if you think of part of the enclosure as wooded internally and then with a series of limestone buildings within it and this white streak revetting wall sitting below them, as you looked up, it would be quite striking. And the upper halt is, although it's a gentler slope going north, it is certainly the highest ridge looking in that direction. It would be easy to spot.
Right, that's very puzzling. Do we have any other questions? Right. I think probably everybody will suddenly think of a question later on. So what I will do now is to thank David most warmly for a fascinating discussion on a very complicated site. I wish you joy of that, trying to sort out the puzzles. Everything seems to be a puzzle in that one, but a very satisfying site, I should think, to work on. Thank you very, very much indeed for a super talk.
Thank you for the invite.
Unfortunately, you'll have to just put up with me saying well done rather than having a round of applause, but just smile
Well, thank you
modestly
very
and
much.
that would be nicely. But thank you very much indeed. And can I say to our members that the next lecture will be on the 9th of February, and it probably will be on Zoom the way things are going. And that will be given by Lisa Westcott Wilkins and Brendan Wilkins, and it will be called Lindisfarne, New Research and New Ways of Working, the Dig Ventures Model in Action. And I look forward to seeing you all then. But thank you again, David. That was very, very interesting indeed. Thank you. And good night.